limited success so far because they're
Doug
quite different in the
Oh, really?
text of the possibilities.
All right, thanks again. I would like to welcome us all back. So now Ed is going to talk about interaction modification and ecosystem stability, a theoretical approach.
Yes, a theoretical approach. Unlike the announcement, Doug said I was going to talk about data. I'm actually sick of data. I've been dealing with Bayesian statistics, computational methods, and Markov chain money for a long time. I hate it. So today I'm just going to talk about this project I've been meaning to get started for I don't know how long, and I'm finally about to start working on it. So this is just a way for me to kickstart the ideas of what this project is going to be. So this is going to be very sort of a broad overview of the ideas and a specific model, or the broad strokes of what will become a specific model. And hopefully have some things. But
Ed, don't you think that little thing in parentheses should be in red?
Danger. Only ideas, no data. So actually, I was surprised to see how much connection there is back to what the sort of tangent we started going off on in terms of constraints and levels. And so this probably won't take that long, and then we can go off to this discussion about whatever we feel like regarding emergence and rules of the game, whatever. But you'll see in this model, I'm going to show there are almost no constraints on the assumption that nature can do anything.
Yeah.
So first, what am I talking about? I'm going to talk about food webs. And food webs are essentially the way they're conceptualized is a network of species in an ecosystem, and you have feeding links of energy and nutrient flow between these. So imagine a whole bunch of these, and we'll just look at one pair of species, a consumer resource, and there's some flow between that, and we're going to say that the per capita rate of flow from R to C is going to be some function of R. So you can imagine modeling this as a simple differential equation. And so this sort of conceptualization of a food web has been the standard one. People typically have modeled food webs as a bunch of nodes with links, and the rate of flow along the link depends on how much predator there is and how much prey there is. And in the very simplest case, even if this predator has, say, multiple resources, in simple models, people will often simply calculate the rate of flow along this link, along this link, along this link, add them up, and say that's going to be the rate of flow into this node. There's sort of some obvious reasons why that might not be true. You can imagine if you're a predator and you're foraging, there's going to be sort of a maximum amount of food you can eat. And that may not depend on what kind of prey it is. If you've got two different species of prey, it's the total amount of prey that you care about that's going to determine when you have to stop eating. It's not going to be it's not sort of going to be determined on a link-by-link basis, because really the things that are operating in the system aren't the links, they're the species. So in this case, we're thinking of feeding links as being modeled as independent entities affected only by the predator and the prey, which, in fact, may not matter, or may not be the way you want to think about it. So in general, you might imagine that actually the rate of flow along this link per unit of predator is going to depend on all three different prey species. Maybe you prefer one prey species more than another. Maybe you can consume one of them more efficiently, and you may sort of adaptively choose which one you're going to take. And so the actual rate along each of these individual links is affected by all three species in the system. One way of thinking about that is saying that, all right, if we still model the system as a bunch of individual links, which in some sense is a fundamental fact that there is energy and nutrients flowing from this species to this other species, and then we think about modifications of those links. And so essentially, the flow rate from R1 to C is modified by the existence of R2, by the existence of R3. And so, in general, now these rates of flow may be functions of all of these prey species. And so I mentioned one reason why this might be true. Feeding saturation, adaptive foraging, and also I put C in there as well, because the more of your fellow predators there may be some nonlinear constraint on how much you can eat because you're in local competition with your fellow predators. But so the feeding links may not be independent entities. These rates may depend on the other prey species. And actually this gets even more complicated when you think about, let's focus in on this middle species who's eating R1, R2, R3, and is now eaten by these top predators, T1 and T2. Let's call this grass and zebra, lion and hyena. Okay. This is done very abstractly.
Lion is grass too?
What's that? So what I'm saying here is actually, all right. So it could be actually that the rate of flow from R1 to C may actually depend not only on the other prey that C has, but may also depend on the predators that C has. And this isn't just because the predators eat C. Obviously, if there's less zebra around, there's going to be less grass eating. But the mere presence of the predators induces a certain trade-off for this herbivore, if you will. Namely, if you want to eat a lot of grass, then you have to go out and run around and find grass, which makes you vulnerable to being eaten and found by predators. So there's this inherent trade-off between how active you are, which can allow you to find more food, and how vulnerable you are to predation. So you have this foraging predation risk trade-off, which means now all of a sudden, okay, so this link from R2 to C is being affected by R3, it's being affected by R1, it's also being affected by T1, it's also being affected by T2. And so all of a sudden, this gets much more complicated. And this is only considering sort of the behavior of this single herbivore in the middle of the system. And so in general, behavior or other phenotypic changes, which are sometimes referred to as phenotypic plasticity, can cause all kinds of other modifications to groups. All right, so now here's an actual, real example from a system that two people here have worked on. This is from a coffee plantation in Mexico that a bunch of people like John Vandermeer's and event perspective worked on. And so this starts with a coffee bush. There's a green scale insect that hangs out on this coffee bush, and this is a stationary thing. It actually, literally, once it establishes, it just sits there, and it's fed on by this lady beetle. So this is a nice simple food web, plant, herbivore, carnivore, basically. But it gets a little more complicated because there's an ant species which actually, in a sense, feeds on the green scale. Not literally, they don't eat the green scale insects, but the green scale insects secrete this nectar for the ants to consume. Now, why would they do that? Well, it turns out that the ant actually patrols the area and protects the green scale insect from the lady beetle. So all of a sudden you have, okay, well, the ant is getting resources from the green scale. It's not really a predator, it's actually a mutualist. But if you ignored that, it would look like a predator. And now the ant is modifying this link. And so merely by the presence of the ant, you have a reduction in the feeding rate between the scale and the lady beetle. And this already is not looking like the example I was showing earlier. This is something different. Furthermore, there's this thing called a decapitating fly. There's actually a lot of different species of decapitating flies or wasps, and so what they do is they'll plant an egg right on the neck of the ant, and when it hatches, it just pops out. The head comes off, and it's really horrible. And so when these flies are buzzing around, the ant wants to protect itself, and the way it does that is literally, there's a nice video of this. I don't have it. The ant literally goes like this, just
No matter.
just protects its neck. It doesn't do anything. And in fact, one of the things it doesn't do is, and I should have actually marked a link there too. It's no longer able to forage, obviously, but it's also no longer able to protect the green scale insect from the lady beetle. So now, effectively, you have the presence of the parasitoid fly has a modification on the modification of this link, and so you have these cascading switches on this ecosystem. And there are a lot of other things in nature. Nature seems to be able to do all kinds of things. Some of them sort of clearly adaptive. Darwin's theory would be useful to explain them. Some of them, from the individual species perspective, probably just accidental. But sort of maybe on a long enough time scale, they may also be evolutionarily adaptive. You can imagine a bacteria, fungus, plant modifying the soil, which then allows the soil to make way for the next successional stage for another plant to come in. And so you have all these kinds of effects that aren't captured by the simple conceptualization of the ecosystem as trophic links. And so it's clear that this stuff happens. But now we're going to zoom way out and say, all right, what does this mean for the structure of an ecosystem as a whole? What does this mean for the dynamics of this over time? So a very simple question is, are ecosystem dynamics with these interaction modifications and these modifications and so on, are these qualitatively different from just a simple trophic dynamics model? Or can we sort of ignore all these little other things and model the system basically as the energy flows? And if say we care about predicting how many fish there are going to be next year, then we pretty much ignore these other kinds of effects. Or does this qualitatively change things? And so there have been a few really simple models that say that, well, yeah, given certain assumptions, this can qualitatively change things. This is a result from a model where they basically just had some nutrients represented as soil, plant level, herbivore level, carnivore level, and so the only kinds of things in the system are between these adjacent trophic levels. And then they just tune they tune a couple other parameters, but here's a plot showing if you just tune a parameter that says how many of the possible modifications to links actually exist in this ecosystem, what's the steady state biomass. And as they increase the number of modifications, in their particular model, it destabilizes the system and tends to reduce the number of species and also the amount of biomass that you can have at steady state.
Is that no data?
What's that? This is somebody else's paper and is generated from a model. So I'm going to make no claim about the realism of this. These are measured from a computer. So basically, if you imagine your food web with the links between species, each of those could be modified by any of the other species in the system. And so this is the fraction of those possible modifications that actually are realized. They have another parameter.
How robust the thing is to changes? Can you think of it that way? You said that you try to make modifications and you look in the response of that to see.
Yeah, so that's, yes, this is a deep and interesting question.
Kind of robustness.
Yeah, and that's one question I'm definitely interested in. They didn't in this paper. The results in the paper are primarily of this form, parameter and some sort of steady state biomass. But you can imagine that something that's only able to sustain a particular number of species at steady state, part of that is because of robustness, because the introduction of new species may tend to destabilize it more than. And I should actually step back and say how this model works a little more. They introduce a species and then keep introducing. Actually, this one I think they sort of generated a random network, I think, and then introduced species from that random network they generated. So they had sort of a fixed regional pool of species that then integrated into their simulation and then simulated with differential equations.
This sounds like it's related to Bob May's early model. Is that right?
Yeah. So I mean, it well, so Bob May's, and we talked about this very briefly at one point. One interesting thing about that is that he wasn't actually simulating ODEs. He was generating, and this is part of the problem. What may be a problem with that analysis is he was actually generating random Jacobians, which some people have now shown don't necessarily actually correspond to realizable systems. But it's definitely in that history of work of this thinking of ecosystem stability. And
Bob was actually very cautious in his original paper. He said, an evolved network is not going to look like this.
Right.
But everybody quoted it the other way around. That complexity increases instability.
Right. So yeah, just for people that are not familiar with the debates in ecology about ecosystem complexity and stability. Basically, there was an assumption among many ecologists, and you can go back and look at early work where people just said, well, the reason we have all this complexity is in nature is because the more complexity you have, the more things balance other things out. Essentially, this is the hand-waving argument. And so if every species has lots of different predators and prey, if one of them goes extinct, then they have others to fall back on. And so you can very easily make an argument, oh, well, this is why ecosystems are complex, because this promotes stability and robustness and persistence. And you can measure stability in lots of different ways. But so Bob May was coming from I believe, an engineering background into ecology or applied physics, and he came in and said, no, this is crazy. Everyone in control theory knows that if you make a more complex system, the thing's going to collapse. I mean, you're going to introduce instabilities, the whole thing is just going to disintegrate. And so he did some simple computer experiments and showed, look, guys, if you increase complexity in these randomly generated networks, you actually get less stable systems. And so sort of since then, the thread in this is, all right, what are destabilizing kind of structures in networks? What are stabilizing structures? And so that's one context in which I'm thinking about this.
Does it matter the kind of redundancy that occurs in a system? So, like, if I think of a clock, for instance, like if one cog goes, I can imagine like the clock not working, but there's not a whole lot of redundancy in a clock. Whereas in nature, we think of systems as having a lot of redundancy, and so I can imagine that those two mechanisms being qualitatively different in terms of the outcome on robustness, right?
I mean, so here, right? If you're this species, or say if you're this species, if this one disappears, it seems likely that this one won't, because it's got there is this built-in redundancy in the system. Unless you tune the parameters in a particular way, and I mean, it is conceivable that the parameters are tuned in such a way to take this out, and it actually does cause such a transient instability that this does go extinct. And so yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, so one thing is some group, a rather smaller group, has looked at things like, what do these networks really look like if you generate them through arms races of various kinds? And they have a very different from any kind of random network. It's the redundancy you're talking about that you see. By the way, most of you know, but it's Sir Robert May who was the chief scientist of Britain, so he had a lot of influence.
At the time
he was doing this, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Just a quick question. Do you know how he defined and measured complexity?
Yeah. He number of species and fraction of possible things realized. And he was generating totally random networks. And so they weren't even predator-prey systems. They were sort of this even more abstract idea of species having positive or negative effects on other species.
I think That's part of the problem. That is not.
That is part of the problem, actually. And predator-prey networks do tend to be much more stable than.
Because if I understood what you said, the argument wasn't that if you take a random network and introduce complexity, it's going to become stable. But if you have a stable one and introduce complexity, it can get more stable.
Yeah, but it can also become less stable.
Well, what you've said, these are both possibilities, and they're both realized.
I see.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's a chicken and egg thing. If you say that complexity means, if you introduce complexity means stability because we have complexity, and we expect that it is stable because we are here, kind of thing.
Right.
We are here and there is complexity.
Yes. Yeah. So this should have had a slide on that. Very good point. Yes. So why do we see particular complex systems in nature? Because those are the particular complex systems in nature that are stable. So you have this tautology of, well, yeah, we have a selection bias. Obviously, what we see is what works. Because if it didn't work, it wouldn't be there. And in essence, that's actually what this project is about. Which I'll get to, but it's asking what affects what works.
Yes.
And how did in physics Bob made a network where he makes a random network, and he said with the complexities, what is the stability? How is that measured?
Stability
in a random network.
So yes. Now this is actually where the details get interesting because a student of Stefano, who I don't know if it's Stefano, but a student of Stefano Alesina at Chicago did some work and showed that what he did doesn't actually work. And what he did was generated. So you can imagine that there's some system of ODEs that defines how the species in the system respond to each other. And you can imagine that there is an equilibrium point.
So you evolve in time, the ODEs.
What's that?
You evolve in time, the ODEs.
Yeah. Well, so you can imagine that you do that, or imagine that you have analytically found the equilibrium. Like this is very different from the intellectual history of physics, where in physics they were solving easy problems, they actually solved them. And in ecology, people started with really hard problems. They couldn't possibly do the math, and so you had 100 years of ecology with people not even, for the most part, doing the math. So that's how these kinds of things got established as kind of naturalism. All right. So this is good. Just turn my talk into full length. Perfect. All right. So this simple question, which is not at all simple, essentially if you model the network as having all of these kinds of crazy modifications to links as well as just the links, are the dynamics qualitatively different? And I said that very vaguely and intentionally, because you can talk about things like how much biomass is supported steady state, but also things like robustness over short time scales, introduction of one species, long time scales. Right, and I showed you this. Right, and then going into the question a little more, how do these differences affect the ecosystem with multiple stability of multiple time scales? This is from that same paper. This is actually what their simulations look like. So they're randomly introducing species over time and letting the systems settle to steady state, and so some species are going extinct. And the way they've structured their model seems to result in something that's really, really stable. And I'm not sure, if you ran this forever, there might be a random event that caused the thing to collapse, but I sort of wonder how realistic their model is if it settles down to something so incredibly predictable. But for comparison, so this picture is from a paper that is not a food web modeling paper. It's a model of, the title of the paper is The Emergence of cooperation, something like that. It's got something about the emergence of cooperation title by Jen and Krishna, 2001. And so the model is it's actually in a way more like this Bob-made model, only they actually were simulating ODEs, and the ODEs were the idea was that these are protein interactions or chemical interactions of some sort, that you're throwing together chemical species in a soup, and you can either catalyze or inhibit the formation of other species. And so the way it's modeled is you either have a positive or a negative effect on other species, and then they simulate for a little while, and then they remove the species with the lowest density, and then they simulate them. Yeah.
I just had a question for general knowledge. Do we think that biomass has increased over the last million years? Is it stayed the same? Has it decreased? I'd like no prior on that.
What exactly is biomass? The mass of Earth?
No, the mass of living things,
living organisms.
organic, trees, ants, grass, fungus, algae. There's a lot of algae out there.
You mean just the last million years?
One
or
data point that's important there is that something like 95% by estimate of the biomass is in single-celled organisms.
Yeah.
So your question really may come down to, do we think there are more single-celled organisms than there used to be?
Yeah.
So obviously, obviously, I have no idea.
So because in the graph that you showed about that everything kind of all the biomass coming to an equilibrium, when we think about organisms, we think that there's much more instability in evolution of organisms and extinction. But in terms of the total biomass, it seems like there may have been a lot of stability.
Yes.
In the amount of biomass in the world.
Yeah. And it may be at the scale. Actually, no. It seems quite plausible that at the scale of the Earth, the amount of biomass is very steady over time.
This is one of those big problems. There are these so-called extinctions, like the Permian, and there it's pretty clear that the total amount of biomass decreased because single-cell organisms disappeared as well during that time.
So if there's exogenous shocks to the system, obviously this would change, but if kind of purely endogenous mechanisms were to carry out, that might be completely reasonable.
However, I think another plausible model is that completely endogenous processes could cause sort of local instability on small time scales. On larger scales of the system, you can look at that and see that same pattern happening on a long time scale. And if you look at the whole Earth, even if you ignore meteors or whatever, perhaps you could have endogenously generated mass extinctions on a global scale. I mean, one might argue that we are currently experiencing an endogenously mass extinction, right? I mean, so right. I was showing you right. This is a nice segue into this picture because. So this is another model. This is there's no biomass constraints. They normalize the system, so there's a replicator equation, so the sum of everything is always 1. But that's not so important. The number of species is also fixed. But this essentially shows that over time you eventually find a highly cooperative system where all of the links are positive. And this level of cooperation in the system is maintained over time. Once you essentially get an autocatalytic set, and so you have these sort of dropping out a little random fluctuation of species that are no longer cooperating, but the ones that are cooperating with everyone else tend to stick around, and so you have this maintenance of cooperation over time on short time scales. On long time scales, you occasionally will get the disappearance of a keystone species, which is an ecological term that they use in the paper. And actually, you exactly what we were just talking about, these endogenously generated collapses. And it'll eventually build back up, have a period of stability. I mean, that time scale is about, what's that? 10 to the 4th. So that corresponds to that. And so actually, you know.
Is the scale there still 0 to 100? It's literally going from 100 to almost 0.
This is 100. Yeah, 100%. This is a graph not of population size, because the population size is constant. It's a graph of the percent of species that are cooperators, or the percent of links that are cooperative links, that are sort of positive interactions.
So symbiotic as opposed to territorial?
Or catalytic, I guess, would be the word they use in this paper. Catalytic as opposed to inhibitory.
So there's some chain reaction that occurred, and mass extinction event occurred, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, so essentially the structures that are forming, they have these particular species that are network hubs of some sort that the maintenance of the whole catalytic network depends on. And so if a species comes in that is strongly inhibitory on that one, just randomly, and this happens randomly every so often, that species gets knocked out and causes the collapse of the rest of the system. And then the process begins again. So I think this is all hand waving at this point. This entire talk is hand waving. Interesting to ask about these dynamics in these ecosystem models as well.
Yeah, I just want to comment. I think that is fascinating. It's a fun analogy between the two, because especially when you synthesis of molecules, or even, especially in enzymes, biological processes, they're just so incredibly clever. They do mutualism. Somebody holds an electron, some other person doesn't. Some other chemical doesn't. So it would be interesting to find analogies.
Yeah. And I'll come back to that with some more hand waving. So just want to mention, there's sort of a couple ways you can go about trying to model these kinds of interactions in ecosystems. One of them is actually go through and identify specific biological mechanisms. So actually say, all right, what are the particular tetrahedral shapes that I can put into my system, and see what the effects these particular mechanisms are. For example, like the predation risk foraging trade-off I mentioned earlier, and sort of encode those into the rules of the game. And so a postdoc in my lab, I'm in Mercedes Pasquale's lab in ecology and evolutionary biology, by the way. Tony Golubsky was doing some of that, and sort of trying to assemble networks with specific kinds of mechanisms for these things. My plan is to basically go in the other direction and assume that there are essentially as few constraints as possible on the kinds of modifications you have, with the idea being that there are many things in nature we don't understand, many kinds of effects, and we don't really know the rules of the game well enough to hypothesize, except that what we see from nature is obviously able to persist in nature, and keep the rule that there's energy and nutrient flow in the system. So there is mass balance going on.
And just so I'm clear, the anything. You mean kind of network?
I mean any kind of network topology. So I obviously am going to have to make modeling assumptions. I'm going to have to make particular assumptions about the functional form of the saturation of feeding in response to prey, the probability of these different kinds of links. But I'm going to say that any kind of network topology, I can also constrain sort of the probability of different network topologies. But in terms of the modifications, I'm going to say that any modification is possible, and any modification is possible, and so on and so forth. And I'll have to add them into the system in a way that the commentators don't explode, but in some kind of exponential decay. But I'm not going to start from particular sets of biological rules to add those links in, at least in the first cut of this. So the model is it's really simple. So say this is our starting point. You add a new species. You add some random links, and again, there are various ways you could determine how to add random links. And I more biologically plausible. You could assign traits to the species and say you're going to tend to eat things that are smaller than you by a particular amount in this particular range, something like that. Or you could add like scripting randomly. And then add random modifications. And again, there are various rules. I'm going to say that all of these are possible, but you may say that you're more likely to affect species that are close to you in the network than species that are far away from you in the network, but still allow those long-distance connections to be possible. And then add random modifications of those modifications, add random modifications of those modifications, and so on and so forth. And then at each of these steps, then you simulate the population growth for a while and say that species gets driven extinct, and then begin the process again, and so on. And so over time, you'll build up some sort of network structure, and I have no results on this yet because I haven't implemented it. But I'll just finish off with like a little more speculation on these themes. One of them is, all right, so let's imagine we have this network. We have a couple of primary producers flowing into this network. We've got what we have here. No omnivores. Interesting. Okay. And then imagine that we have like a perfect copy of this over here. So we have these two compartments in the network that are identical, but then imagine that for some reason this species here is able to increase the flow from that. One can imagine, and again, this, depending on the specific dynamical rules, this may or may not be true, that by extracting more resources from this node than, say, this side of the network is going to be able to, that this entire side of the network is able to sort of bring more resources toward itself. And this is when I start getting into dangerous territory with biologists, because all of a sudden I'm starting to say, all right, well, this group of species over here is doing better than this group of species over here. We have something like group selection going on, perhaps, where we have pieces of the network that are cooperating together and causing themselves to do better. And so it's plausible that maybe this modification will destabilize this and knock this side of the network out, or it'll knock this side of the network out.
Can I say something? Which I'm not a biologist, but I've read a little bit about this recently. Just thought it was fun. But I talked to some people who are working on lichen, and I don't know if you know about lichen. But so they are symbiotic organisms. So you would imagine that your network is like one organism, basically. But then they grow and they're looking for food, and then so one part in one end basically finds food, and what happens is that the other end basically retracts and moves in this way. So I don't know. It just made me think of this.
Are they so? But is it all the same genome?
So lichen are interesting because they're actually symbiotic organisms between algae and fungi.
Right.
So it's not very clear that it's one organism or many.
Right.
So this is another complicated question, but like for biologists, I believe. But I just thought that if you're working on this, maybe this is something you could talk to someone about or think about. I don't know.
But like this general idea that basically you've got clearly in nature you have the evolution of cooperating organisms. You have the ants and the scale insects.
Or you have a positive feedback there, right? In this case, you have something that's increasing this population here, and then the guy that is formed is making increase its own population. So you have this positive feedback.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I totally understood your example though. So the lichen are you saying that one of the
so it's like the part that is finding more resources is growing and the other is going to die out. I don't know, something like that.
And when you say the part, you mean like the fungus?
Oh no, they're symbiotic. So the whole thing is both fungus and algae. But
So you're thinking about this as sort of like
as one
space.
organism. Yeah,
Like this
that's right.
axis
That's right.
of
Yeah,
space and
that's
then-
right.
Okay.
I don't know if it's useful in
Yeah.
any way, but I just thought of it, and if you're, I don't know, maybe.
Yes. I mean, so that's actually sort of a whole other realm, like explicitly putting this into space and what corresponds to this network structure. But also, like if those are different, if they're in the same genome, then it really makes sense to think about them as being sort of certainly the same species, right? And if they're reproducing with each other, the same species, and possibly even the same organism, if they're literally the same genome. Yeah. So,
Anyway, yeah.
yes.
Well, to state this another way, it's possibly just my own reading, but most of the stuff that I read in this general area doesn't put much emphasis on autocatalytic loops and things like that. And yet the systems that I know about are just totally entangled. I mean, they're not, all going this way with occasional modification. The systems are, and of course, such things are extremely hard to analyze.
How do you start modeling that, right?
Yeah. But, one way we know about this is that Hebb's theory of the central nervous system makes a big thing about recirculation of pulses. Here we are more than 50 years down the line, and we don't have much more analysis than we had when he put it forth.
So it seems like this field is just ripe for better methods of analysis.
I think so. So I'm excited to work on this. Get away from data and statistics for a little while.
Start being creative and do something that.
So we're probably out of time, but anyway, so the broad general point is that I think that these kinds of modified links, essentially they expand dramatically the palette of the kinds of interactions you can have, and in particular, exactly what you're talking about, these sort of autocatalytic loops that may not be obvious if you look at the system from this perspective, that may emerge. But then the next slide is, all right, well, what if we actually do have loops, right? And this may make this process even more powerful, because this is already something that is self-reinforcing. Not perfectly, not in the sense of catalysts that have an external supply of resources, because there's an efficiency loss at every stage of this. So this decays as it goes around this loop. So it's a little different than neural networks, perhaps, or autocatalytic loops with sort of a good supply of input. But yeah, definitely these kinds of structures have not been considered very much. I mean, all these food web models, like the one I showed earlier, they posit like 3 trophic levels, and then maybe one detrital loop back to the bottom. But so yeah, so I'm basically going to leave it there with the field wide open.
One big question, Ed.
Ignorance.
So you make some real progress on this. You've got a fairly neat framework. How do you get published? Everybody in the journals in these areas, they just don't want to see frameworks. They want to see, what we now call big data mining.
I'll just put it on my website. Put on a website and email everyone I know.
Yeah.
The future of scientific propagation.
Make your own journal.
I'll pay Elsevier to make me a journal.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a lot of money, but it's good.
Yeah, it's been done.
Well, this side of it is, so to speak, been solved. The thing that hasn't been solved is us old guys that count publications in major journals to determine whether you get tenure. And that really has not been solved. That is a big, big problem.
Well, I mean, publishing is important.
But publishing in the right journal for the right field is another story.
I mean, I think the time scale is too short on this stuff, right? It's like if you have something sexy, you can get it in Science right now.
Yeah.
Even if it's wrong.
Yeah.
10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, the fact that it was published in Science probably doesn't matter.
You have a better faculty position by then.
Exactly. So you have this path dependence, right?
Yeah.
Where because you got published in Science.
Well, it's like the cooperation graph. You go along, and finally you get tenure, then you can do what you want to do.
And is that the quality then that was attained
Yeah, perhaps. Perhaps, yeah.
Something really interesting in the beginning of your talk where there was a modification in the network, and then you mentioned we can just think of it as stages. It's equivalent to a predator acting on the system. I think possibly a worthwhile pursuit here would be to see if you could, if there's an equivalent network topological structure that consists solely of predators and prey that would be analogous in its function to this, to a network with modification.
I'm not even sure I said that. I said that.
Well, so I at least sparked the idea in my mind.
Okay.
It's because then you could take any such very complicated structure with a lot of modifications and then create an equivalent structure that's purely a predator-prey model.
Well, I guess that's a question.
That's impossible, I'm not sure.
Can you do that?
And if you can prove that it's impossible, then that would also be very interesting. If you can show that their analysis can be.
It's got to be some great mathematician. Are you a great mathematician?
Not yet.
I mean, yeah. In theory, could you model a nonlinear system as any nonlinear system decompose it into an infinite number of linear systems,
or at least if you can show that no finite predator-prey system can represent the equivalent behavior of a system with 1, 2, 3 degrees of modification, then you clearly have something.
I bet you could prove that given a particular form for your predator-prey equations and a particular form for your modification systems, plausibly, that you could prove that they're qualitatively different. But,
I mean,
I'm not a mathematician.
if you did prove that it is true that you could always create such an equivalent structure, then that also provides another path for analysis.
So that's interesting.
We have one more.
One more question.
Do ecologists do experiments in closed systems?
Yeah.
And is this data that you are looking at, or that is
Not for this project.
Because you showed the graphs and they're all computational models, right? But have these people sort of looked? I mean, I suppose they have. No, they haven't. Or they look at the experimental data. Is there a relation? Like, do they try to?
Well, let me quote
think
something that Jeff West got started on scaling by Jim Brown at University of New Mexico. Jim Brown's key experiment was to take closed fields in Arizona, and the keystone predator was the kangaroo rat. The fits came them out, but nothing else. They were going to look at this field for 1 year to see if there are any changes. It's now almost 20 years later, and it's still changing. And new species are showing up that show up nowhere else in Arizona, all this kind of stuff. Well, it gives you an idea how intricate these things are. Yeah.
Like the cougars coming to hunt the deer.
Yeah.
I mean, people have been successful saying, I have this model of 2 species, and I can show, a discrete time model can show the chaotic dynamics, and then they control it perfectly and demonstrate the chaotic dynamics between, these 2 species. But when you're talking about these things with, like, this project is kind of dependent on having lots of species, and so you can, like, for example, the ant-phorid thing, they have actually done an experiment demonstrating the effect of this phorid fly on the rate of energy flow between the.
So I suppose my question is, you do a model and you find something. How do you evaluate this? What is your outcome? Like, how do you interpret it? If it makes sense, if it's real, are you making a prediction after that? What do you do with it? Because I'm not in the field.
No, the answer to that.
How far away?
It's an easier question for some other projects. It's a hard question for this, and it's something that I need to think more about.
I mean, I don't have a problem. So I'm not like a person that would ask, I want to see an application of this. But even so, you think that maybe the interpretation that it would have some conceptual, like that it would make us understand the systems better. But my question is, how do you know that, especially in your model, because you say that you allow a lot of possibilities.
Right.
So you're going to get a lot of outcomes.
Well, I think that's an open question.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I don't think I know yet what the range of outcomes analysis going to be because the stability constraints may be pretty strong. But I still think what you're asking is a totally valid question that I can't possibly answer.
How would you distinguish the question you're asking from asking that same question to Darwin when he puts forth his framework?
But he had a lot of evidence.
No, but
But indirect.
there was a lot of
true.
observation, right? So my question is,
it was pretty indirect.
I'm happy. I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with that. I guess but I don't have enough background to understand how you would, like in what you're describing in your model, how you're going to, you have these possibilities and you get like 10 outcomes.
Well,
I think I was going to say one really, really cool thing about what Ed's doing, I think, is that if he can sort of show this range of possibilities and show some cool phenomena, then you can go back to the copy system even and look to see if those phenomena exist. So sort of to drive it the other way, to drive up
If the
new
population
observations.
doesn't die out, you know that you're safe at least. It's survived.
You may be able to show why the scale insects are not hyper-jazzed with all the coffee they're getting.
But I mean, to answer it like in a really general way, if there are particular predictions that are failing under the current models of just looking at these things as boxes with flows between them, and you show that this is wholly inadequate, that if you allow these other things, that your analysis completely breaks down, then you basically say, all right, now we have to start looking much harder for these things in nature and actually start to identify them. Anyway, it's a non-answer.
Well, one thing that these guys who had my class have heard me shout at is there are the kind of models that you use for prediction, but there are also the kind of models that you can call existence-proof models, where you show that something is either possible or impossible. And those can guide your thinking a lot.
Yeah. That's why I said. So is it that you're gonna, it will help you understand conceptually, interpret what is happening in reality. So I'm totally happy with that.
And certainly that's where I'm coming. To me, this is a thought experiment. It's a conceptual model. I'm not trying to say, this is Michigan woodlands in June. I think I'm way over time, so yeah.